Well, the last couple of days we've been talking about how that when we come to Christ, that He not only delivers us from the bondage of sin and slavery to its ways, but He brings us into a new way of life. We would call it really the beginnings of eternal life, because the moment I'm saved, I receive the gift of eternal life. I'm made alive by God's presence in my life, so that I have this guarantee, as we talked about being sealed by God, that when I die, I'm going to go to heaven and be with the Lord. But the fact that God has put that eternal life into me right now, it's not something I'm waiting to acquire in the future sometime, but it's mine right at this moment, means that He wants to accomplish something in me. He has a purpose that He wants to fulfill. And that's really what Paul begins to speak about in verse 14. He says, "For He," speaking of Christ, "Himself is our peace, who has made the two one and has destroyed the barrier and the dividing wall of hostility." Well, who is he talking about, the dividing wall of hostility? In the early church, it was the hostility between Jews and Christians. There was great hostility. As we've been studying the book of Acts, one of the things we find is that the hostility within the church in Rome was so great that Emperor Claudius actually kicked all of the Jews out of Rome for a season because they were fighting over the issue of Christ within the synagogues. Paul was very aware of this division, this hostility. Now, when we read this, we have to realize this extends to all kinds of hostilities, especially hostility that arises between Christians. And it's interesting because we're seeing an increasing level of hostility on all sorts of different issues, whether they be political issues or medical issues. We have people who are pro-vax, those who are anti-vax. We got all this stuff where people are biting and devouring, and as Paul would say to the Galatians, you're just going to end up consuming each other. Basically, a lot of these issues, they say, let people be persuaded in their own minds. Don't just. We're not talking about clear-cut moral issues like abortion. So if you're a Christian and you support abortion, I don't understand that thinking whatsoever. I think you're deeply deceived because you're believing something that's a blatant lie, that you can take a life and it has no consequences. But I'll save that for another day and another discussion. But at the same time, Paul was looking at this division within the church between Jewish and Gentile converts, and he said he abolished in his flesh the law in its commandments and its regulations. In other words, when Christ died on the cross, he met the demands of the Mosaic law. That his sin was a propitiation, the payment, if you will, for all the obligations and that we had because of our violation of that. And he said he did this for a reason. He goes on to say his purpose was to create in himself one new man out of two, and thus making peace. And in this one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. He put to death their hostility. So that when we find ourselves in a hostile relationship with other people, and I would love to say that never happens, but it happens far more frequently than any of us would like to admit, at least to others. But when we find ourselves in that hostility, the thing we need to recognize is that in itself is contrary to the will of God. That if I've given place to hostility towards my brethren, then I have been overtaken by the devil. I've given him a foothold in my life, and he seeks to take me captive. It will not lead to a good end, because once you let him get that chain around your neck, he will drag you deeper and deeper and lower. You encounter this all the time in Christianity. You have people saying, well, I was going to this church and this happened and that happened and I was betrayed and my heart was broken and I was disappointed. And therefore, my response is, I don't want anything to do with Christianity anymore. Well, first of all, if they're truly saved, that's impossible. The hound of heaven won't let you off that easy. But if the people really do go away and live another life and choose another way of living their life without Christ, I have serious questions whether or not they've ever truly met him. They may have been convinced at some time, but they were not what I would say converted. They've been Christianized, but they hadn't been really born again. They just knew the ethics, but they didn't know the author of those ethics and those moralities. Well, and so that's kind of another issue. But having said that, when we allow the enemy to embitter us against one another, then we're really just going to find ourselves becoming less and less fruitful, because one of the things that Paul said in Romans is that the wrath of God does not accomplish the righteousness of God. the wrath of man, does not accomplish the righteousness of God, that no good thing can come out of me being angry and bitter and resentful. In fact, he said, my objective should be to forgive. And the other person may not change their behavior, but nonetheless, that's not my issue. I can't control what they do and the choices they make. But I need to really ask God, when somebody has done something wrong to me, I need to be willing to say, Lord, give me a heart that forgives them. Now, keep in mind, I'm not saying that you forget what they've done and you just let them continue to do it. But at the same time, even though if they continue to harm you, you don't respond with bitter and anger and wrath. You just keep on forgiving them. And you realize that if they're a dishonest or distrustful person, that you're not going to allow yourself to be put in a situation where they can continue to take advantage of you. I think this is one of the key misunderstandings we have about forgiveness. But at the same time, we don't allow it to define how we view that person. They may not be faithful, they may not be trustworthy, but they are lovable to God. He loves them the way they are, and I need to continue to show love towards them. I forgive you for what you've done, but I'm not going to allow you to continue to do it in my life. And I think that's an important critical distinction that we need to make, because many times people think that we're called to be doormats, and we're not. We're called to be proclaimers of Christ, to be lights into the world, and realize that sometimes if the enemy completely persecutes the church and shuts them down, well, we can't control that. We can't do anything about that. But one of the things I love in just the testimony of Richard Wurmbrand, who was in a Soviet prison in Romania after World War II, and he was there for, I think, 11 years as a prisoner. And he was beaten regularly, tortured a lot, suffered greatly because of his faith. And one of his persecutors said to him, I bet you hate communists. And he says, no, I hate communism, but I don't hate communists. I love communists. And that ability to make that distinction, I recognize that what's driving you is a damnable ideology. You believe something that's evil and wicked. But I tell you what, I still love you because I know that you've been deceived and led astray. Now, can I say that I have gone through that kind of thing and understand it? No, but I hope and pray by faith, if I'm ever having to walk in those shoes, that I will be able to stand fast in my faith. And I know that you pray that as well. But this becomes the idea, what is the purpose? Well, part of his purpose was to remove the hostility that exists between people and to help us begin to live in peace with one another, not only with just Christians, but even having a peaceful attitude towards non-Christians. And I think it's pretty important for us to hear that right now, because there's a lot of animus being expressed by Christians towards the government and a lot of other things that are going on around us. And I think that's a satanic trap. But I'll wait till tomorrow to explain why I think that's the case. So God bless you, and we'll finish this up tomorrow.